the very first thing to note about your Apple Watch measuring your heart rate is that if you ever take it off, sometimes you'll see it flash this green light. And there's a very specific reason why green light is being used here. And there's two actually. The first is that your red blood cells absorb green light. And that's a very important thing because the more red blood cells you have, the more green light will get absorbed. And also, green light has a nice property in the fact that it will penetrate to a certain depth within your skin such that it's able to get to the papillary dermis layer. And so right now, if we're looking at your skin, the outermost skin, the epidermis, is mostly dead stuff. It's all these dead cells, and they get other things infused into them like keratin, and that's what makes your skin this barrier to the outside world so that you can maintain homeostasis. And so basically, we can't really tell your heart rate that well just by looking at the epidermis because the epidermis is just dead. So a little bit deep to that, just barely deep to that, is your papillary dermis. And your papillary dermis is where you're going to have a bunch of capillaries present. And those capillaries have the job of basically getting the red blood cells to the tissues so they can actually supply the oxygen, take that carbon dioxide, and also do things like maintain temperature of a given tissue. And so that's where you're really going to have a lot of the action happening in terms of the amount of red blood cells present. So that's the layer you want to actually be measuring your heart rate at. And so what's happening in your Apple Watch is that it's emitting this green light from that LED. You see it flash sometimes. It's emitting that green light through your epidermis down into your papillary dermis layer. And then depending on the number of red blood cells that are present, some of that green light's going to get absorbed. And that's going to be a variable amount depending on how many of those red blood cells are present. And so what your Apple Watch also has on it is a thing to detect how much green light comes back. So it knows how much green light it puts out, and then it's also going to check how much green light actually comes back to it, how much green light is reflected. And so the more red blood cells are absorbing that green light, the less green light there's going to be reflected. And so that's how it's working. And so really what the Apple Watch is doing is hundreds of times a second, it's pulsing green light through your epidermis and into your papillary dermis. And within that papillary dermis, it's going to get reflected or absorbed, some combination of the two. And it's checking to see how much of that green light comes back. And so if you were to plot an axis where time is on the x-axis and the absorbance of green light is on the y-axis, that would come from the detector that is built into this thing, you would see how it fluctuates between 2 points. And we don't even really care what those 2 points are. But all we care about is that we're going to see how at one point there's a certain absorbance of green light, and at another point there's a little bit less absorbance of green light, and it just keeps on coming back and forth. And so what happens when you look at one of those cycles is that your heartbeat just beat one time. And so that's the reason why it's so able to actually figure all this stuff out, is it's looking at that change, that rate between how often is it cycling, how often is that green light absorption cycling in that papillary dermis layer. And so from that, it's able to then calculate the frequency, and generally they're going to do some kind of running average. So typically they'll say, the last 5 minutes, your heart rate's been this. So that's how this thing works, and that's how this thing is able to determine what your activity level is, because the more active you are, obviously, the more your heart's going to be beating. And so there's other factors here that can influence your heart rate, like caffeine or other stimulants, but the gist of it is that this is how your Apple Watch is able to determine what your heart rate is just by sitting on your skin like that. And so I thought that was pretty cool. Thank you all for watching. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll talk to you guys next time.